Hi, welcome to Ross and Zed Talk Games. I'm Ross, and I'm here with my friend Zed. Today we're going to be talking about trademarks, licensing, and movie tie-ins and merchandising. Zed, can you talk to us a little bit about some trademark principles and basics?
So we started with some trademark principles in the first podcast, but to review, a trademark is a symbol or word that associates a product with a source in the mind of the consumer. For example, when you see the little apple on the back of a computer, or iMac, or any number of other things, iPhone, really anything, your mind pops back to Apple, the company, and that's because of really good trademark use. But trademarks can also be shared using licensing, and licensing is the process of, if Apple wanted to make an iVideo game, then they would license their Apple mark to go on the cover, and that video game would reflect back on the entire franchise that is Apple. So overall, trademarks can be used to specify a particular line of products, for example, phones, or they can be used to talk about an entire industry or group of products that all come from the same company.
Now, is that kind of branding limited only to trademarks, or does that invoke other kinds of intellectual property?
Oh, it absolutely invokes other types of intellectual property. For example, if we're going to use a book in a movie, we're going to encounter copyright issues and other issues of that nature, intellectual property issues.
Okay, a way that this really applies to video games is that a lot of video games are based on licenses from books or music or movies. They serve as tie-in products and cross-promotional products, but also derivative works in a lot of ways. This really got started in the early 1980s and really came to the forefront with games based on films on the Atari 2600. Some of the best-selling, notorious, or extremely popular games included Superman, which was based on the comic book, E.T., based on the very popular film, Star Wars games, Indiana Jones games. A lot of those found their way onto the Atari 2600, and for very good reason. I mean, licensed games are very popular because you're already piggybacking on the public goodwill of a pre-established franchise. People who really liked E.T. or really liked Superman had already been sold on that content, and seeing it in a video game just made perfect sense. It was a really easy merchandising tie-in. And some of the best games that have been based on films have strengthened that brand recognition and merchandising. Some that I always like to point to is GoldenEye 64, which was a licensed game based on a film that was fantastic and in many ways outlived the strength of its origin. GoldenEye 64 remains to be an extremely popular game, over 10 years from when the film came out. And I think its staying power is actually stronger than the original film. And that happens with a lot of games, but it's not always exclusive to good titles. There are a lot of bad video games based on films as well. Some of the most famous examples include E.T. for the Atari 2600 and also Superman 64. These were games that were intended to be, merchandising products to, piggyback off of a pre-existing license. But because their quality wasn't as strong as their source material, they actually served to tarnish the brand name that they were supposed to increase.
And that's what makes bad video games so much more interesting than good video games when it comes to licensed games. Where good video games have issues like what's in the contract, who gets what royalties, what are we allowed to use, bad video games bring up the issue of tarnishment or dilution, whereby a trademark owner could lose some of their rights if the game serves to harm the image of the franchise in the mind of the consumer.
And this is something that we've seen more recently because, I think in part just because there are so many more games coming out now than in years past, and so many of them happen to be based on movies. I think a lot of mainstream first-run films, it's just a foregone conclusion that they're going to have a video game tie-in. And some of these are based on very long-running franchises. For example, the Aliens franchise from 20th Century Fox has several games, two at least, that have come out this year. One of them was fairly good. One of them was pretty much critically panned. Aliens Colonial Marines was released by Sega and was not met with a strong following. And for myself, a big fan of the Aliens franchise, I was really disappointed that the game didn't live up to my expectations, and I think other people's expectations as well. So that made me lose a little bit of faith in the quality of the franchise, and it's that kind of relationship between consumers, games, music, movies. It's all part of the same thing, but all of those end products, regardless of the media form, all reflect on a larger ball of intellectual property rights.
It's particularly interesting when we wind up with these movies and games, or movies, games, books, music, and everything else, where they start to diverge. We've seen this particularly with the Resident Evil series, where if you showed someone a Resident Evil game after they'd watched the most recent Resident Evil movie, I'm not entirely sure that they would be reasonably convinced that the two were related aside from the existence of Umbrella Corp. So where do we go from there?
Right, and we see that a lot with book adaptations as well. You know, for Lord of the Rings, we started with a book that was adapted into several films, and then there were video game adaptations based on the book itself before the New Line Cinema Peter Jackson films were ever released, and then the movies themselves spawned their own video games. So then we have this almost a confusion in the marketplace of what the origin of a particular game is. Where's the license coming from? In the case of Lord of the Rings, is it coming from the Tolkien estate because it's based on the novel, or is it coming from New Line Cinema or MGM because it's based on the film franchise? All of those things are related to Lord of the Rings, all those same characters, places, and scenarios, but you get this different source of origin, and when trademarks serve to indicate a source, you have a possible tarnishment or damaging of those intellectual property rights in trademark when you have that divergence of confusion of indicator.
To confuse things even further, lately we've had things like the Lego movies, where you have a toy that was revamped using movies, which spawned video games, and then there were also video game tie-ins with licensed characters like Lego Batman, Lego Indiana Jones. So there's this convergence of licensed material where you can't tarnish any of that material in your use of it, but you also have to be careful to stay true to the core material, which in this case would be Lego, or maybe Batman. It's really hard to tell in those situations.
That's right. Is that I think we're getting to a point now where producers of content and intellectual property are becoming very cognizant of the fact that over licensing or excessive licensing across mediums without supervision can in fact tarnish a brand very terribly. When you start looking at Marvel and DC, who have these comic properties that they hold very near and dear, they've been licensing everything. They sell t-shirts, they sell coffee mugs, they sell video games, and all of these things are manufactured usually by a third party. They're not made in-house. Marvel doesn't have a coffee mug division to the best of my knowledge. So all of those things come from a license, and it falls on the producer of the content to kind of police who they license things to and in what capacity to protect the strength of their mark.
You see, you think that it's actually picking up in the amount people are policing their marks. I worry that they aren't policing their marks nearly enough. We see a lot of issues, particularly in the mobile space, with games that are made as tie-ins for movies, particularly targeting children. And this may just be laziness on the part, where they think that children won't notice that this Wall-E game is terrible, this Wall-E movie is amazing. But it does seem like there's a tarnishment issue there if I, as someone who understands these two things, picked one up and was like, nope, this is not exactly what I thought it would be.
Definitely, and it works in both directions where, I think we've spent some time today talking about how video games can be based on movies or vice versa, but you just see so many examples of this and you just wonder, where does it stop? It's really a cyclical relationship where, Angry Birds is another great example of a game that's becoming a movie, and I think it's a safe bet to say that there will be a game based on the movie based on the game. And it's something that I think a lot of intellectual property owners are going to have to be very aware of in terms of protecting their marks.
It's very concerning, especially with the rise of the Tetris movie, which I don't know how that is going to be a thing, but they say that there's all kinds of lore within the Tetris universe that we are unaware of, and this idea of lore is a huge part of branding and creating a franchise. We see it in Star Wars all the time.
Absolutely, and trying to determine what the canon story is always a point of contention with large franchises, especially with Star Wars, because there again you had an example of a movie which led to TV specials, which led to books and toys, and then there were movies and books and toys based on the movies, books, and toys. It never really ends. But what kind of advice would you give to a producer of content in policing their trademark?
Well, just as general information, I'd say that watch what they're doing and make sure that it meets standards. It's best to put those standards directly into a contract, but a contract should contain everything you need for the producer of material to make something to your specifications, but it should not be relied on as the source of those rules. You should show up, check products, have specs, make sure everything is legitimate before allowing to be released to your public and consumers.
I agree. I think that in that situation, quality is going to be leading the forefront. You have to make sure that anything that you license is maintaining a certain level of quality to represent your brand. And in addition to that, not just the quality of your goods, but also the quality of the reputation of your brand.
Yeah.
You have to make every effort that you can from a public relations standpoint, from a relationship with your consumer, that the products that you make are made well and delivered well to your public, and that it represents, the kind of image that you want with your consumers. And in the way that you police and protect those marks, it's always important that you come from a place of trying to protect your integrity, but not at the expense of looking greedy or chasing customers. I've seen this happen a lot with larger corporations like Disney or George Lucas with Star Wars, where they are very ambitious in protecting the quality of their marks, but too often are susceptible to being accused of doing it, just with only the dollar signs in mind and not necessarily the quality of the product that they're licensing.
Definitely. All right, well, I think that does it for us today. Thanks for listening to another episode of Ross and Zed Talk Games.
Have a good one.